This is my second favorite prayer. Sometime I'll show you my favorite. Can you guys see it? You want to say it together? From the cowardice that there is not creation in truth, from the laziness that is contented with half truth, from the arrogance that thinks it knows all truth. Good Lord, deliver me.
You should see that prayer in Congress before you start their.
They wouldn't understand. So this is a different class. It's been a while since I've taught 3 classes back to back to back. But this is going to be sort of an evolving class. And I've got what I'd like to cover today, but if we don't get to it, we've got 2 more classes, so we can take our time. So, the point of the class is I'm going to try to give you the tools to understand how to integrate your secular outlook and your spiritual outlook. I grew up in a very conservative fundamentalist home where secular was bad at all times. And it was only after I left college and before I started graduate school that I started thinking about that we're all secular in certain ways, and it took me a while. And so for the last 30 years, I've been trying to figure out how to fit these things together, and I'm sure for the next 30 years, I'll be still thinking about it. So if I taught this class a year from now, it'd probably be very different. I'm going to be relying on certain writers that you may or may not have heard of. The main one, you'll hear me refer to today, my wife says I read big books so you don't have to. It's called A Secular Age by Charles Taylor. He's a Canadian philosopher and Catholic who decided to tackle this issue of how we got into our secular age. And he is Catholic and he is a theist, and he tried to integrate these things. I don't agree with him on everything, but what he has to say is pretty novel and interesting. So it's not just me that's interested in this topic. There are a number of theologians and sociologists and other people who are very interested in this topic too. And in fact, about 120, 130 years ago, there came to be this theory that emerged called secularization theory. Is anybody familiar with this? You probably are, but you don't know it. And that is that eventually, as we evolve, we will become more and more secular and less religious. And it's not just individually, but also collectively as a society. We'll all become it'll reach a point sometime in the future that God no longer exists, that God will be dead. And there's a guy named James George Fraser who put this together. He wrote a book called The Golden Bough, which he tried to take all of the myths in the world, put them together, and it was part of his theory that we were moving from a society that was magic, and then we went to religion, and then eventually we would go to science, and the first 2 would disappear. You can't read it. It's tribal animism, then to polytheism, to monotheism, and then finally all of us would get to atheism. Okay? The only problem with this over the last 120 and 130 years, particularly in America, but other places as well, is that this hasn't happened. Even though we've become more and more secular, and I'm not saying we're not secular. Secularism is a huge force, again, collectively, and for all of us individually. But the level of religious involvement and how we think about religion is just as intense as it was 120 years ago. What has happened in the last 10 years has been a decline in institutional religion. And so there was a class I taught last year called Spiritual But Not Religious. These people continue to be religious, but they continue to be spiritual. They think about God. God is a very important part of their lives. They're just not going to church anymore. And these are primarily young, educated, well-to-do people who fit into that category. One other guy I'm going to make reference to frequently is a Lutheran scholar called Peter Berger. He's a sociologist, and for the 50s, 60s, and 70s, he was the leading theorist of secularization theory. And he had great ideas, lots of novel concepts, and he was even, started giving times when he thought Christianity would fade from the scene. But just recently, he's come to the realization that this isn't happening, and he's gone out and publicly acknowledged that he was wrong. His quote here is, I would say secularization theory has been massively falsified, and secularists are a minority in most of the world. And uses the US, but he even points to Europe, where again, institutional Christianity is dropped, but still a number of people are religious at that time. I'm going to show you just a short video of him talking about the change in his perspective on this.
Characterizing an age is always a risky business, but calling ours an age of relativity is, I think, a good bet. Many people, not least theologians, still believe that our age is one of secularity. The underlying assumption of this belief is the so-called secularization theory. Once you strip it of its often pretentious sociological jargon, the basic thesis is simple. Modernization means a decline of religion in the institutional order and in the consciousness of individuals. Along with a broad consensus among scholars of religion at that time, I also adhered to this theory and indeed contributed to it. I was wrong. It took me about 20 years to reach this conclusion, but that is another story. Let me say that those of us who shared this mistake were not totally wrong. Modernity has in fact changed the social and psychological environment of religion. But this change is not necessarily secularizing, except in certain parts of the world, notably in Western and Central Europe. But that too is another story. Most of the world today, including not unimportantly the United States, is witnessing powerful eruptions of religious passion, some with far-reaching cultural, political, and economic consequences. A little over 100 years ago, Nietzsche proclaimed the death of God on the cusp of what he thought would be an atheistic age. If he had lived, he would have been disappointed. Not long ago, I saw a bumper sticker, all places. Dear Mr. Nietzsche, you are dead. Yours very truly, Carl. We have about 6 institutions of higher learning in the greater.
So again, what I want to do during this session is get away from Mr. Berger back there. Is give you some terms that are going to be important for the next 2 weeks, some terms you probably don't know, and a little background on how we got to where we are. And as I said, this is something that happens in society, not the same, secularization is not the same in America as it is in India or as it is in England. But for the most part, I'm talking about secularization here. And some of you might be interested and say, but this is slightly different. And largely that's because the institutions are different in each of those places. In England, you have a queen and an institutional religion. Here you don't. So people respond in different ways to those things. And I'm going to talk about it using some metaphors. And I'm going to talk about it primarily as lenses. A term we'll run into in a few seconds is immanent frames. But we're going to talk about it right now as a spiritual lens and a secular lens. And it's interesting, I've been thinking about this sort of stuff, and I hadn't really expected to see it played out with my kids. And around the age of 14 or 15, I started realizing that they were having these conflicts between the two types of lenses that they had grown up with. The one being the spiritual lens, and another one being there's secular lens, the way they were taught to see the world. And I remember being at church one time when my son Zach was 16, and he was shaking his head and scribbling stuff when we had a sermon that dealt with the story of Lazarus. And I said, are there passages in the Bible that you find difficult to believe? And he wrote back, yes. That's what these little sheets of paper are for in church. And he said that the Lazarus story was one of them. And then I wrote back to him, and I was thinking about these things about how we integrate them. And I said, why? And he said, because it's just seems incredible to him, not very believable. And I said, you know, you should notice during our prayer requests that we, without thinking about, reflexively integrate our secular and our spiritual views. When we make requests for someone's healing, we don't say certain things. We don't ask people, like in the story of Lazarus, to bring people back from the dead. That's just not something we're going to request, even though that's something in Scripture, something that's in the New Testament. I said we never ask for God to do something that's not medically possible. We work within that framework. We don't ask God to rebuild a limb for somebody. That's just not something we do because it's not medically possible. So we take what's medically possible, and then our views and the way we talk about it fit within that context. So a couple of years later, my daughter Sophie, who's now 18, I wrote and asked her the same thing, and I kept what she had to write. And I said, she was shaking her head during the service. And again, she was having problems, and it was Pastor Gary talking, and she loves Pastor Gary, but she was having a serious time with it. And I said, we went back and forth. Is there something that bothers you, something that you have a hard time believing that's in the Bible? And she wrote, there are a lot of things I have a hard time believing. Miracles. It kind of takes away from the true good, like a cheap trick. And then I said, I asked Zach the same question 2 years ago, and he said the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead was very difficult for him. And she said, it's like, hey, I'm God. I can do these things, like make people come alive after death, but not really, just for a select few. Your loved ones die and stay dead. Too bad I didn't really teach you how to deal with that. You know, it's a funny thing because I was expecting something a little simpler than that. And she throws that, and I was like, I don't think I can answer on that. But just 2 weeks ago, a week and a half ago, I taught confirmation, 9th grade, not confirmation, in which we talk about the Bible and these issues. And it's interesting. It's a bunch of 14 and 15-year-olds. And I threw out some tough and unpleasant passages for them. And it was interesting to see how these things conflicted with them. And when I was growing up, we had to memorize huge sections of the Bible. And then my undergraduate degree, one of them is in ancient Greek. So I had to translate a lot of New Testament. And it's funny to me that the kids don't know a lot of passages. So I threw out one saying where Elisha recently becomes a prophet. And he's sitting there praying. And a bunch of kids come along, see him and say, hey, baldy head, and start making fun of him, and it upsets him. And then out of the wilderness come a couple she-bears, and they eat 42 of the kids. And the kids were like, what? Where did that come from? and they were really upset about it. And I did various topics, and it was interesting to see. And it's my 6 principles, and maybe I should do this for adult, my 6 principles for understanding the Bible and dealing with tough passages. In fact, I heard the women's group had recently had an issue with how do you deal with what's basically ethnic cleansing in the Old Testament, where God tells them to wipe out an entire group of people. And again, this is a conflict from our secular understanding of how things should be in respect for the individual and so forth, and our understanding that Scripture is the Word of God, and those two things come in conflict. And the kids one after another, and 35 of them, it's hard to keep 35 kids interested. But when you start reading passages like that, they were all incredibly engaged. And Gretchen said a week after, she asked them if they could tick off my 6 things, and she was like, oh yeah, they know them all, but they know most about the she-bear. Did you want to say something?
Well, I'm teaching freshmen at Marquette, and we just finished going through surveying the Old Testament, and we went through all the exact same passages. And freshmen in college and freshmen in high school they're separated by a few years. And if anything, a freshman in college is going to be even more troubled by these things.
Well, it emerges, and it's part of what I call the Lutheran life passage, which is that you start off, you go to Sunday school, you go through Sunday school, you get confirmed, then you get hit with all of these things in school that teach you how to think about things in secular terms. No one really helps you during that time. You go to college, you abandon the faith. then you get married, and then you have kids, and then you say, well, I'm gonna do this all over again, and you start coming back to church and you bring your kids because it seems like the right thing to do. And you know, Pastor Gary's old church, his old joke about that we had bats here for a little while at the church, and the janitor asked him how to get rid of the bats, and he said to confirm them. So, as I said, we're going to talk about this in terms of lenses, and there are other metaphors that you could use, okay? So, we all come with, not we all, maybe some people here, prefer a secular perspective on all things, and that's you know, that's fine, and there's a good argument to be made for doing that. But for most of us here, I'm assuming, and my wife Sonia was last night said to me, "Are you really assuming that?" There might be people who don't agree with that, but this is the thing that we were taught growing up, and that most of us, when we approach Scripture, these are the assumptions we bring with us. You like his lenses, by the way. Scripture is written or inspired by God. So we bring this idea that there is a God, a theistic perspective, and they have something to do with the creation of the Bible, okay? And it provides, as the creator of it, it provides a lens back on him. 2, it's mistake-free. Now, maybe not on everything, but it largely tells us the way things used to be. 3, it's relevant today. And 4, it's easy to understand. And there's a guy named James Kugel who's written another massive tome on how to read the Bible, and he goes through and reads it 2 different ways. He reads it the traditional way, the way people read it for 1,800 years, and then the critical, historical way people, scholars read the last 200 years. And he lays out these 4 assumptions. The only thing is, he says that the first 3 are something that people have believed throughout the last 2,000 years. Up until about 200 years, the belief was that it was actually difficult to understand and that you needed an expert to do it. Since sola scriptura and all that, we've now come to the idea that it is easier to understand, even if that's not the case. So we bring this spiritual lens when we're reading the Bible, and we also bring a secular lens. And this is not just related to the Bible. This is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about secularism. First, the cosmos should be understood on its own terms. When you're going to talk about the money, you understand money in terms of economic theory, macro theory, micro theory, right? 2, reality is considered orderly and causal. And this is an assumption we have. I mean, and the thing is, the way paradigms work and how they shift, someone comes up with a theory that explains an orderly organization to how society is, and then it sort of doesn't quite work exactly. Someone points out problems, the whole thing collapses, and then we build another idea. But we have this assumption that it's causal, one thing leads to another, and that there's a certain order to the way that the world works. 3, science is a principal tool for obtaining facts, and facts are very important. And this is something you should think about when I'm talking about the Bible. A guy named Houston Smith, a religious scholar, says that we've become fact fundamentalists today, that we have a greater appreciation. If something is factual, we think it's better. And you can think about it in terms of our great pieces of literature today. That poetry's not usually in there. I don't know how many of you read poetry. I've read one book of poetry in the past year, and that's it. Whereas, you know, in the 1600s, Milton writes everything in that form. So facts are very important, and people assume or think that things should be factual. And when you hear the debates between the new atheists, those people that say attack Christianity and religion in general, and the people responding to them, they're assuming that everything in the Bible is factually true. They're bringing this assumption, this fact fundamentalism with them, and they're attacking their own assumption. But there are lots of people who don't think everything in the Bible is factual. And then 4th, knowledge is divided into numerous disciplines. You know, just name a particular topic, you isolate it, separate it from other stuff, and then you analyze it. That's how the secular mind works. The problem is when you put on one pair of lens and then the other set of lenses, you often get distortion. And another way of thinking about it is not with lenses. If you want to use another metaphor, I like to tell people it creates static. And so you're trying to fit these things together, and when I was with that class of the kids, there was a lot of static going on. Because I showed them a couple passages, and I'll show you one that was, well, both of these are bothersome. One is in 1 Timothy 2, where the author says that women should not wear pearls, gold, that they should keep their mouths shut when in church, and that their salvation comes through childbearing. And one kid raised their hand and said, "That's in the Bible?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's in your Bible." Yeah, we don't get that on Sunday morning. I'm going to give you a couple passages that I found created static for me when I started thinking through these things. And I had an assumption, and I grew up in a fundamentalist background. Everything is literally true. The world's 6,000 years old. Catholics aren't Christians, and only we have the truth. This is a passage from Joshua 10, and it's similar to what the women were reading in the women's group and that they were having problems. It starts, "On the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, 'Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Ajalon.' So the sun stood still and the moon stopped till the nation avenged itself on its enemies, as is written in the book of Jasher," which is a book we don't have. Someone was borrowing from that and including that in this. "The sun stopped in the middle of the day and delayed going down about a full day. There's never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a human being." It's the only time. Why are we praying? Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel. Obviously, for me, when you start reading this and you start thinking about how things operate, you know, the interesting thing is many of us create an exception and say, this is something that happened only this one particular time. But the fact is, if you were at that time, most religious literature would have stories like this, maybe not the sun stopping or whatever. But this is not just a problem that we run into with the Old Testament. I mean, if you read the book of Revelation, there are any number of issues in there in terms of destruction of people and so forth. But here's one that I call Fright Night, Matthew 27. "And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit." This is Matthew when he dies. This is a passage we all should know, but something we never read. "At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom." We all know that. "The earth shook." We all know that. "Rocks split open, and tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people." It's just a weird story. It's similar to the Mark 14 story, where they're in the Garden of Gethsemane, they arrest Jesus, and there's a guy who runs through it. Does anyone know what happens? There's a guy with just a robe on, and they said, "Hey, who are you?" And they grab his robe off, and the guy goes running naked through the garden, and he's off, and we learn nothing more about him. My interest is if we ever do a passion play and build it would be the best passion play ever.
They've done it at football games.
Which is a religious service of sorts. So, I've given you a couple passages that created this static or this distortion for me. Are there any passages for you guys that you can think of that create that sort of thing for you? The virgin birth? You find that, when I say difficult, you mean difficult to think of as factually true? Okay, any reason why?
I just don't think it was possible.
Okay. Actually, you were
Well,
next.
I was gonna say, when people were bringing Paul handkerchiefs and aprons, having him touch it, and then they took them back, and their friends were healed from
Right.
just touching that. It's kind of,
I think the Old Testament story, and I don't have all the details, where the guest comes to the person's house and the mob is going to molest them, and he says, "Here, take my daughters instead."
Oh yeah, Rosie's story. And when Phyllis Tribble calls, she lays out 6. Phyllis Tribble's a theologian who's at Northwestern. She calls them texts of terror. stories in which horrible things happen to women, and there's no condemnation in the text. They just go on. Someone does something horrible, offers up their daughter, says, you know, the first thing you see coming out of my house, you can have for the rest of your life, and his daughter runs out. I mean, there are a number of these numbers. She's got 6, but I'm sure you can come with others. Anybody else have a passage that?
In the Acts of the Apostles, where they're all together and they share all of their belongings, and the one couple hold out on them,
And
they
that's the fire,
got
right?
killed
Yeah.
because of that. Yeah.
So, you know, it's interesting, yours was a factual, historical, medical sort of thing, and that's more of a justice issue. And, I mean, those things are, you might not know, connected, and they're the result of the way we think about things now. And in each of these cases, to use terms that you're probably familiar with, it creates cognitive dissonance. You've got the one lens, the other lens, you put them together, and you have to figure out some way to resolve it. Most Lutherans resolve it by just not reading the Bible. I want, as I said to you, this isn't just related to the Bible or what's going on in church. We bring a secular outlook to many of the things that we do in life. And in fact, when someone approaches one of these topics from a spiritual perspective, I find it pretty jarring. One case is weather. Now, if you read the Bible, and we just have God holding the sun still frequently, weather is something that happens to us because of the way that God acted. In fact, there are acts of God that both good and bad in the Bible. People pray for the weather to go one way or the other, and they want their crops to be good or bad. And it's usually what's called Deuteronomic theology, that if you're good, God brings good weather and good crops. If you're bad, he brings bad weather, bad crops. And again, it's not individually, it's collectively. And this is one thing that you need to understand when we hop back to the Middle Ages, is you have a community, and if everybody's doing the right thing, then God will reward us. But if somebody's not doing the right thing, that affects us all. So it's a lot harder to question the values of the community, because the community will ostracize you. And you believe, possibly, if you're wrong, that it's going to bring some sort of harm to the community. Here's a case of Pat Robertson using his spiritual perspective. I'm not saying it's the spiritual perspective, but his understanding of how God works. One's the earthquake in Haiti.
A bigger question for people spiritually
This
is
is
always,
tornadoes
not
in
so
the
much why
Midwest.
did God send them, but why didn't he intervene? You don't you think people always ask that question when there's tragedy?
If enough people were praying, he would intervene. You could pray. Jesus stilled the storm. You can still storms.
So you have his saying. Was that the storm? So you have him there saying that all you needed to do was pray, and the tornado wouldn't have come to you, and the community in Illinois that they were talking about was wiped out because people didn't pray. And so, as I said, this is sort of a jarring perspective when, you know, we're used to thinking of the weather as something that comes on at 6 and 10 o'clock, and not something that it's understood as a scientific phenomenon. Here's him on Haiti.
And you know, Christy, something happened a long time ago in Haiti, and people may not want to talk about it. They were under the heel of the French, Napoleon III or whatever. And they got together and swore a pact to the devil. They said, we will serve you if you'll get us free from the French. Truthfully. And so the devil said, okay, it's a deal. And they kicked the French out. The Haitians revolted and got themselves free. But ever since, they have been cursed by one thing after the other, desperately poor. That island of Hispaniola is one island. It's cut down the middle. On the one side is Haiti, on the other side is the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic is prosperous, healthy, full of resorts, etc. Haiti is in desperate poverty. Same island. They need to have, and we need to pray for them, a great turning to God And out of this tragedy, I'm optimistic something good may come.
I do think that the evening weather would be much more interesting if John Milan talked about weather in that way. Tornado's coming, Brookfield, you're not doing enough. It's gotta be Brookfield, I never do that. So weather's one example of where people used to think about it using primarily a spiritual lens, but now almost all of us think about it in terms of a secular lens. It's something that you understood, to go back to my definition of this secular, weather is something we understand on its own terms. It's causal, one thing leads to another. We use science to understand it, and it's something split off from most other things. Another thing is military. We used to think of, if you read the Bible, we saw the passage that God is with one group and he's upset with another. Even polytheistic societies, the Romans would take chickens, cut them up, and do divination to try to figure out whether the gods were with them or against them as they went to war. But today we have military science, and I've created a link, but we're not going to go to it. But you can hear one guy who gets a lot of attention for his non-secular understanding of war today, and that's Fred Phelps at the Westboro Baptist Church, who believes anytime there's Americans killed on the battlefield, it's God's condemnation of America for its stance on gay rights. So when I hear that, and for most people, we usually think about today who has the best bombers, or who has the best generals, or what sort of strategy are we going to, what was the term in Iraq, whether we were going to throw everybody in there or not. Yeah, the surge, whether you're going to do a surge or not a surge, those are all, we're talking about in terms, on its own terms. Then you hear Fred Phelps protest at a military funeral, saying it's because of America's view on gay rights that these people died during the surge. It's just jarring. And again, you can think of any number of other topics that are like this. Agriculture, I mentioned related to the rains. Today we have agriculture science. You can get degrees in that sort of thing. Politics, we used to have divine right of kings. Romans tells us that the kings are selected, that our leaders are selected by God. Today we select them based on how they do in game shows and night shows and medicine, which I was thinking, well, obviously we do that, but I saw the show that's going on right now on National Geographic with the snake handlers, and having been to one of those churches once, I don't know why I went. Actually, that was Sonia's question. Why are you going there? But I thought, it would be, interesting to see that perspective. But the leader of the church is bitten by a copperhead, and they get around, they decide should we go to the hospital or not, and the people say, if you go to the hospital, it's a lack of faith. So it's all interpreted in that way, and so they make the decision not to. So those are different things that we have an almost exclusively secular perspective on. And I've called it a secular frame. We're going to start changing in just a minute to an immanent frame. So I'm going to go from where we are now to how we got where we are. And there are some terms that I have to tell you to help us for the next 2 weeks.
Well, and what I find interesting about the snake handler, your snake handler experience, is that that activity is based on the long ending of Mark's gospel, which is actually not even part of the original
When you say Mark 16, it stops at verse 8. It's a very difficult passage because if you go back and you read the end of Mark, it ends with the women coming to the tomb. A person in white tells them that Jesus is resurrected and gone. It doesn't say it's an angel, but the person in white says, now go back and tell the disciples, and they don't. They are fearful and they flee and they never tell the disciples, and it ends there. It's difficult. And some of the people writing it out, passing it from generation to generation, found it harder and harder. And so around the year 200, someone came up with a longer version where they actually did go back and tell them, and Jesus comes back, does a number of things, and people are able to drink poison, which they do at the snake handling churches, and handle snakes. So he was just saying it's interesting. This text actually doesn't go back to the author of Mark, but to someone who had issues with the way Mark was written. It's an interesting passage. So to get back to understand where we got to today, Charles Taylor, the guy with the fat book, puts his key question this way. Why was it virtually impossible not to believe in God in, say, 1500 in our Western society, while in 2000, many of us find this not only easy, but even inescapable? And actually, David Brooks, the columnist for New York Times, writes it a little more simply and easier to understand. How did we move from the all-encompassing sacred cosmos to our current world in which faith is a choice, in which some people believe, choose to believe, and others don't, and a lot of us are somewhere in the middle? So how did we get from that point to our point? And this is the way I want you to think about it, and it's very hard for us to imagine what the mindset was in the year 1500, okay? First of all, I want you to think about it in terms of immersion. This is a huge aquarium in Atlanta. If you haven't been there, it's pretty amazing. But you think about being in the middle of this water, and you can think of not being any other place. You're so surrounded by God, okay? God is everywhere. There's no place that God isn't. God is the divine cosmos. It's not the universe, it's the divine cosmos, okay? And when something happens, it's an act of God. 2, the order, our social order, everything around us is divinely ordained. There's a hierarchy everywhere. Usually, most of us are at the bottom of the hierarchy, but there's a hierarchy in the church. There's a hierarchy in the society. There's a hierarchy in the political realm. And there's a hierarchy in our local church. And I also say divinely ordained time. Time is seen as going from major religious liturgical event to major liturgical religious event. Whereas today we think of it as secular, just, we go along. The only difference at Christmas is most of us make sure we go to church, but otherwise it's not something that we talk about in that way. And then finally, the world is enchanted. And enchanted sounds like a positive word, but it means that there are spiritual forces of good and evil all around us. And as I said, this is very hard for us to grasp. And the best way to get a sense of what this felt like for someone in the Middle Ages is through medieval art. This is the Isenheim altar in Colmar, France. One of the most famous drawings of the paintings of the 14th century. This is St. Anthony, and this is their illustration of what temptation looks like. You've got demons who, to portray demons, you offer them up as these horrible figures all around you, pulling at you, pushing at you, and you've got to fight them off. They're everywhere, okay? And this is Hieronymus Bosch, and I wish I could make this bigger, because this is like an incredible, incredible painting. It looks like surrealism when you look at some of the little figures. There's like a fish here eating another fish. Here's a spiritual figure. He's on a flying frog with 2 demons underneath him, sending him around. And then this area, the religious figures under attack. You have demons coming in by water, by sky, and by land. And you're just surrounded by evil, okay? And you've got to do what you can to ward off evil. And that would mean in some cases that you would go get relics. You would make sure you go to church. Each year, every congregation, every parish would take the Holy Host. They would have a service, take the host, go out, and they would march around the perimeter of the parish to make sure they marked it off to keep the evil forces from coming. And then there were obviously people who realized and believed this system, thought everything around them was evil, that they would tap into that to try to get at other people. There are terms like the Black Mass or whatever. But it's impossible for us to understand, or it's hard for us to understand, that this was a very, very, very frightening situation. You are surrounded, you don't have, your kid gets sick, and that means something is happening. I've got to figure it out. And it's not just demons and devils. Inanimate objects have these sort of spiritual issues. So you don't know if a particular tree is on your side or whatever. It's all around you. This is the medieval mindset. And there's a good book, if anybody's interested, that I can pass along to you, that just deals with how frightening this is. And when you see these things, they look like, oh, that's cool. But this is their representation of how horrible these things are. So there come to be Christian reformers who, and Luther is obviously one of the major reformers, but he's not the first one. There are other people who are very upset, and they come to the conclusion that this is not the sort of life that we should have.
There's another American modern artist by the name of Benjamin West, and the art museum had one of his paintings. I looked them up online. He's done a lot of them, the tomb and some other, but the one that they had down there was the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And my wife actually could not look at it. It frightened her.
But you know, the difference is, when you look at Bosch, and we have only 27 of his works, he did hundreds of them, but we have only 27, and he did these triptychs where there are 3 panels, and there's a before, middle, and then an after. He has one that's a presentation of heaven, which is really, really scary. I don't know why anyone would want to go there. A presentation of hell, which is even scarier. It's amazing. They look like Salvador Dali stuff, these huge heads that come and eat you. And again, demons everywhere. And you know, he's representing what people, you know, if I'm going to explain the feeling you have when you're under demonic attack, this is what it feels like. So if you have a time, just go online, type in Bosch, B-O-S-C-H, and just see how, you can actually in Europe buy the little figures that he drew from the painting there, and they're amazing and interesting. So, but they're come to be Christian reformers, and for a lot of people, when they think about secularism, they think it happened because people sat around, came up with the notion of science, started pushing along, had scientific discoveries, and religion retreated as a result. And Charles Taylor and about 4 other scholars have pointed out that actually secularism is the consequence of a process that started with Christian reform in the late Middle Ages and early modern times. And we all know about the indulgences and how Luther criticized them, but that was only one part of an entire realm of things that were under attack by reformers. There's indulgences, but there's also this black magic. There's this use of relics. There's the use of the host as like a magic toy. And so all of those things, what they were saying is we need to get back to the Bible, and they actually are referring to a period of time, the Axial Age, where Christianity is seen mainly as a social institution and not as this all-encompassing thing that keeps wars off the enemy. Second, the priesthood of believers. Now, if you were asked in the year 1400, are you religious? 99% of the people would say no. Because religious refers to the guys who were at the monastery and the convent. Today, if you guys are asked if you're religious, you would say yes, or sort of, or I, should be. But the idea was that everybody should be acting and have the same practices as the people of the clergy. 3, sola scriptura, that we should read the Bible and we should be able to interpret it, and the Bible is one of the key points for understanding faith. And then finally, glory to God alone, which is that this notion that God alone initiates our salvation. We can't, through good works, become a Christian, and we can't, like Aquinas says, reason our way to salvation. God is very much radically different than what we are, okay? So each of these things we know had effects in little ways, but they also have, they have a number of unintended consequences. Things go off in a number of different directions. And this is one person's paradigm, a scholar's paradigm of what happens. That you get individualism, the Protestant ethic, and rationality, and all of those things lead to today. It's a little too complex, but I'm going to go back to these 4 points. And my this is Charles Taylor and my interpretation of it. That one thing that I forgot to tell you, and that is when you're immersed in faith, that there's I told you the divine cosmos order and divine presence. The term with that is you're embedded in society. You're deeply involved in each of those 3 things. So with the attack on folk religion, there came to be a different understanding of how reality worked. We went from a society, and I told you the term was enchanted, where there's demons and angels and everything all around us, to a world where those things disappear, okay? Society is largely orderly, we can understand the rules of nature and so forth. And there's a term for this, it's called disenchantment, okay? A writer in the early 1900s, Max Weber, came up with this term. And it's not a great term because it's a translation from a German term, but it's disenchantment. So we went from a world that was very enchanted, it was an enchanted society. Today, we've moved to a society of disenchantment, okay? The priesthood of believers. And that is, we came to believe that there was nothing special about the clergy, but it went on, it went outside the church. We started saying, what about political figures? Is there anything special about them? Well, actually, they're sort of like us. And in this embedding that we talked about ends up receding. So in the first one, enchantment recedes, then embedding recedes, and then the next category, the sola scriptura, we're taught to think about our faith in very, very, very rational terms, okay? So in the 1500s, 1400s, religion is mainly an emotional and communal act. You express your religion through going to church and worshiping. And you know, you can get a sense of what medieval religion was like and the medieval church service is like by going to an Orthodox service. If you go to an Orthodox service, it's clear the liturgy is not being done for you. Much of what happens goes on behind a screen. Everybody sings, and it seems like people are doing different things at different times. The theology is that God is the audience, not you. It's not important what you get out of it. It's important what God gets out of it. And this is what heaven's going to be like. That's the notion. Well, we don't have a notion like that at all. You know, we switched to contemporary worship because we like that music a little bit better. It's about us. It's not about doing a service and doing something that's supposed to represent God. We discussed was, you know, did we like the sermon? Did we not like the sermon? I mean, again, it's all about us. And then the last one, glory to God alone. God ends up being moved out of the system. God is, as I said, radically other. The result is God ends up being moved up into the sky and far away. He becomes transcendent. In the Middle Ages, he was transcendent, but he was also immanent down here with us. He's in both places. As a result of these reforms and other things, as we came to understand society through science, God ends up getting moved back. So today, our default perspective is this secular frame. From time to time, we take the religious frame and put it on top of it, or we substitute it. But this is the way we see it. And these are the terms that I want you guys to know for when we're talking about this the next 2 weeks. So first, we're in a disenchanted world, a world in which we're not surrounded by all these spiritual forces all the time, okay? And in fact, it's interesting, for our entertainment, we have a good bit of nostalgia about this. You read novels with magical realism, you have stuff going on, stuff that doesn't actually happen. In movies, what's the name of the guy, Night in... Right, a lot of his stuff is just dramatic, it's spiritual forces all around, and it's a world that they're actually taking the medieval mindset, dressing it up, making it much nicer. You lose the fear and the awe that you had at that time. But and you mentioned Harry Potter. It's a very different, you know, that's the sort of nostalgia and romanticism for that particular time. You also see as these spiritual forces move away, you can see a particular point in American history where the reformers run right directly into people with a different perspective, and that's the Salem witch trials. You have a society where we start talking about magic as being a bad thing, and those that reform it should be condemned, and then many of them end up being killed. So when you think of the Salem witch trials, it's these two forces, secular mindset and spiritual mindset, colliding at that particular time. Next, the immanent frame.
There's, I think, a very important perspective that's left out of that religious reform, and that was the reintroduction from the New Testament especially, that God is not distant and fearful, but God is immanent and gracious.
So you're getting like way ahead to second and third week.
Well,
we're trying to figure out where we are and how we got where we are. And you know, there are good things and bad things about where we are. And we're gonna talk about, you know, with the advantage and disadvantage of where we are. And, you know, the thing is, we end up creating our own religion in a sense now, instead of having it imposed on top, because we've been disembedded, removed from the society. So the imminent frame, as I said, has become our default perspective on most things. When something happens, we pick up the newspaper and read it, it's actually, it's not just telling you what happened yesterday, it's a secular, it's instructing people, it's a secular way of understanding the developments usually from yesterday or the day before. You don't see stories except for on personal religious issues like homosexuality, abortion, things like that. Those are about the only times you see religious figures in print. Religion writers are rare people these days. But for most things that we encounter, we start off with this imminent or secular frame. And he uses imminent because God has been moved out there, and we start understanding the world and everything around us on their own terms. As I said, whatever the topic is, many of you guys have degrees in certain areas. We even had a discussion about talking about depression in a class like this. And you run into this problem because there's a whole imminent frame for understanding depression, and there are religious ways too. And next week we'll start talking about how do you end up putting these two things together. Let me run through, I'm gonna run through, and we have just a few minutes to get to it. Buffered self. This is a little bit of it sounds like a more complicated term than it is, but in the Middle Ages, you didn't think yourself as being separated from the world. Demons and angels can pass through you, take possession of you, and do all sorts of things to you. Illness comes into you. It's not something that develops within you. And as a result of all these changes, we end up isolating ourselves, and we become what Charles Taylor says is a buffered self, okay? And this changes the way we think about how we are and what causes us to be the way we are. We start looking inside ourselves for the reasons for illnesses, psychological disorders, and so forth. In the Middle Ages, you would never have done that. It's some sort of external force that's pounding on you. The fourth term that I want you to know. So first one, disenchanted world. We've got that one. That is, we're not surrounded by all these evil and good forces. Two, imminent frame. We see things based on a materialistic assumption. We see things and think about them on their own terms, whatever the topic. Buffered self, we're self-contained, and we don't have demons running in and out of us all the time. The fourth one is, as a result of this religious reform, there was a nova effect. Things just blew up and went in a bunch of different directions. The general understanding about secularism, and still the dominant view, is that you have science, and as science goes forward, religion recedes. But in fact, that's not the way it works. What's happened is religion, is this transcendent perspective, the spiritual perspective, is blown up and gone in a bunch of different directions. And we all now have not one or two choices. We're not naive about what we believe. We can choose from any of these other options. One of the options is not to believe any of these other spiritual beliefs. That's one of the options. Or, you know, when I was growing up, my parents got divorced. I didn't know what to do. I was a very confused individual. So for a short time, I was Methodist, I was Presbyterian, I was Episcopalian, and before I learned the truth and became a Lutheran. And then the last term, which we'll develop next time. And you know, I had a friend who was doing it. Now he's went from being a Southern Baptist to being a monk on Mount Athos. His name has gone from being Miles to Athanasius. So he was the best man at my wedding. So it's interesting, this nova effect. When you see also, when you think about Catholics, that 1 out of every 3 Catholics today starts as a Catholic but does not end up as a Catholic, okay? And we have many, and Connor taught the class last week, we have many Catholics who are at this church. And then the last one, and next week I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about this, is over time we've developed this notion of how we operate and how we should be. It's called expressive individualism. And this has really emerged that everybody here has a right to the pursuit of happiness, and that defines what you think about most things. This is a summary, my summary of this, and since I'm giving you some of these terms, it makes sense, but we're going to revisit this and next week when we start talking about how this affects us individually and communally. The disciplined self, as I said, we're the ones now in charge of what we're doing. This one doesn't mean, you know, that we're, you know, that this is something that we've done through rigorous work. It's just that we're in charge of what we are. replace the poor self, the one where things are going through us and we don't have control over what happens to us. Vulnerable to external forces, spirits, and demons, with a new buffered self, a disciplined and free agent living in a progressively disenchanted world. And again, this disenchantment happens over time. And the result is, as I said, this expressive individualism, and I'll talk about this in great detail next week, and that is religious practice. And how does this affect our faith and our religion? This is the bottom line. Whereas I told you, a liturgical service used to be that we were acting as a choir and presenting to God, who was the audience, to where today, the thing is, did it matter to me? Did it speak to me? Is this a place where I want to be? Is this nurturing me spiritually? The point is, religious practice is now not only a personal choice, but it must make sense in terms of one's own personal spiritual development. Okay? And again, I'm not saying this is good or bad. I'm saying this is Western society and this dramatic shift that we've had from the question that Charles Taylor asked. How did we go from where naively everybody accepted God? That was just the default position, to today where you're making choices all the time. And obviously, consumer capitalism plays a part in that, where we're making choices about everything from cereals to religion. But it's also a result of this Christian reform that was started by the people in the late Middle Ages and by Luther. So next week, we're going to talk about where we are now and the options that you have for integrating your spiritual perspective on things and your secular perspective on things. Sorry, I ran a little bit over. We'll take a couple questions and then we'll be done. Go ahead.
I'm just curious if that last thing you mentioned, the rugged individualism, is part of what leads people to, you go back and you say, well, the secularization, people are believing in weather science.
Right.
So they believe in weather science, and they believe the 3-day forecast, and the 1-week forecast. And
Right.
somebody told me they weren't going to take a jacket to Atlanta, because 2 months from now it's going to be 50 degrees inside. He looked it up on the web. But this person's adamantly against global warming. So what happens when we hit this wall where we believe these scientific facts or projections, and then we just say, oh no, I don't?
Well, you know, it's how do you accommodate those two perspectives? How do you end up putting them together? And when they conflict, which one is the default? If you are a fundamentalist, you think that the default is always the spiritual perspective. If you are a humanist or an atheist or even agnostic, when the two conflict, science is always going to be the default perspective. The thing is, for most Christians, there's somewhere in between those two. And the question is, when do you end up accommodating one, and when do you accommodate the other? And that serves as an ad for the next class. Okay. Did someone else have a question? Okay.
When you talked about buffering, it reminded me when we were in Nova Scotia and St. John's, when the British got there, they found the French who had been there for a while, they were disgusted because they were filthy. They never washed. And they wanted to know why, and they said because diseases and everything comes through the skin, and they wanted to keep that from happening.
You confused me when you said when we were in Nova Scotia. I was thinking like you were talking about the Tosa Common Council.
Oh, no.
What are you doing?
We're somewhere else.
No, I get that. Actually, if you want a good presentation of this shift in perspectives, do you guys know the writer Thomas Pynchon? He wrote a book called Mason-Dixon. He's a very one of the top novelists in America. He wrote a book called Mason-Dixon, and Mason and Dixon are drawing the line, the Mason-Dixon line in the 1700s. And when they get there, there's all of this magic going on. Rabbits talk. People are getting sick. There are demons all around. And as they draw the line and implement the scientific process of mapping, those things disappear behind them. And so that's what the novel is about, is their work and how the one recedes as they go forward. Now that fits more the perspective I told you earlier about the secularization theory. It's not something I buy into, but it's an interesting adaptation, a metaphorical